Have you ever noticed that when some people go about their day, they stay very grounded in tangible reality and their senses? They probably focus on things like food, fashion, what's happening in the news. And another group of people is a bit more focused on ideas or possible realities. For example, getting lost in thought about the time that my 9th grade math teacher said that there were 11 dimensions. I mean, is that true? I want to go read up on that now. What I'm describing here is the difference between sensing and intuition. Everyone has some aspects of both, but we are going to talk today about which you prefer to do and how that impacts how you navigate reality and how you connect with other people. And at the end, we'll discuss some potential areas for growth, improvement, and learning so that we can both navigate our world in a hopefully more effective way, but definitely connect better with others who maybe have a different process than ourselves. Welcome to Immersion, 30 Minutes Beneath the Surface. I'm your host, Pamela, and here we explore psychology and philosophy to find meaning in the modern world. Let's dive in. The idea of how we process information being split between sensing and intuition was first proposed by Carl Jung in his 1921 book, Psychological Types. Also in this book, he proposed the idea of introversion and extraversion, an idea that you've surely heard of. So I think that this dichotomy, sensing and intuition, is just as interesting, actually more interesting than introversion and extroversion. It's just not talked about as much. You might have also heard of the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, or the MBTI. And if you ever heard of people saying, oh, I'm an ESTP or an INFJ, these letters are describing that assessment. Now, Carl Jung did not come up with that assessment. That was created by Isabel Myers and Catherine Briggs. There are strengths and limitations to that test, and many people in the psychological community, whether they have a PhD in the research or clinical space, they're not really big fans of this test. And I understand why. But we're not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because I do think there's a lot of value in understanding the difference between sensing and intuition. And lastly, before we jump into the meat and potatoes of these different types, if you want to take an assessment before we get into that so that you're not influenced when you take it, sometimes if you think of wanting to be a certain type, it changes how you answer certain questions. I'll link an assessment or two linked down below, and you can come back here after you've done it if you want. So let's more clearly define these two types. Sensors take in the physical world with their senses in a tangible way. They also think in a linear fashion. A leads to B. But this doesn't mean that they're not creative. A sensor might look like a master craftsman or artisan or technician. They just happen to be a bit more linear in their thinking. They're often more detail-oriented rather than big picture. So they think in terms of the concrete. What is actually here happening now? And they are very influenced by the past and the present, because again, that's connected to tangible reality, unlike a possible future. And it could be tempting to stereotype here, to think, oh, well, they would be a good cook or some job that requires following steps. But anyone can have any job and excel, I believe, in any area. The way they approach that work might just look very different. A sensor might see a lot of value in following a recipe first and learning from that, whereas an intuitive might want to jump in and just say, well, I don't know, why don't we try it like this and see what happens? But again, personality typing is really nuanced, and a lot of other factors could also impact how you approach a recipe. But I do just want to say that if you've ever encountered this as an assessment to get hired for a job, there is a lot of pushback against that, because anyone, regardless of their personality type, could do well in a certain job. Let's now talk about intuition. Intuition is more about abstract concepts, imaginative possibilities, and what can be. Hence the connection to future over the past and present. They often have insight for pattern recognition. For instance, while having a cup, they might think, oh, I think I want to store pencils in this. Or why do we even use cups when we used to drink out of the bowls? When do you think that we started to use cups? There's a bit of jumping around, and then the sensor wants to slap them and just say, please drink the water. Can you drink the water now? I'm kidding, but this does highlight a tendency for people to often devalue the other way of thinking. Sometimes sensors think that an intuitive is lost in unimportant thoughts that don't really impact reality, when we'll get into later, often theories do greatly impact reality. An intuitive might think that a sensor is too bogged down in the details and that they're missing the big picture. So it's really important, as we'll get into, to find ways to meet in the middle in terms of processing and speaking. I'll give an example from my life as an intuitive about how I would often miss certain details and how I'm trying to learn to grow in this area. As a strength coach, I often would focus on the big picture, the big rocks, holistic thinking. What are the best cues I can help give this person? And my first few years as a strength coach, I didn't know as much about anatomy as I ideally would. I mean, I knew enough to pass the exams, but no additional knowledge there. But the deeper I got into the field and just started to encounter more anatomy and incorporate it into my training, it completely changed how I coached. Not only in terms of exercise selections, like, the serratus anterior can help stabilize the shoulder, and not only focusing on the posterior part of the shoulder, but then also understanding when I teach clients about the actual anatomy, it helps them move more effectively because they understand what's happening in their body in a deeper, more grounded way. So this is an example where someone who's focused on the whole forest can settle in and drop into the trees and go a lot deeper in their work. So we can lean into our gifts while also learning to appreciate and grow these other aspects. Now, I want to talk a little bit about which type is more common and how this impacts our world. Sensors comprise 70 to 75% of the population, which means intuitives make up between 25 and 30%. So while they're not incredibly rare, I have heard it stated that being an intuitive is sort of like having a left-handed brain. Your brain just works a little bit differently than the majority of the planet. Now, sometimes on places like Reddit, this can lead people to think we're special. We have this unique ability. And I mean, yes, it's less common, but I don't think that it's more special. Because, for instance, yes, an intuitive might be a visionary in the sense that they might have an idea of, we need to change this. But it often takes a sensor to make sure that that revolution even happens. So this is where a team of people with different skills is really what makes the biggest impact. And I think that it can also help us have a little bit of compassion for ourselves if we are an intuitive, because it is a sensor's world, I've heard it said. So if you're at a party and everyone is talking about maybe the latest sports game or interior design or where their kids are going to school or their latest travel, and you want to talk about some really nerdy idea or theory that you've read about lately, even if it does organically come up where it might make sense to come up in conversation, not everyone might be interested in it. But this is where, when you meet your people, it can be extremely invigorating. And when you're at a party and you do care about some of the same ideas, you feel so incredibly alive and excited. This is partly why I have this podcast and YouTube channel, is to connect with people. And I think the internet has been really helpful for intuitives. If you're on Reddit, you might think the majority of people on Myers-Briggs are intuitives, but that's because intuitives are more likely to take these personality tests and then talk about these personality tests. So they're overrepresented in those circles, even if they are less represented in the general population. And another interesting fact that I learned is that we often become more balanced over time. So if someone maybe scored an 80% in one area, if they were to retest something like their MBTI 20 years down the line, they might score a 62% in that area. I do think, though, there might be some exceptions. Like, I have gotten a lot more balanced for my other letters, but not for this one. So I don't know. It might depend. I also think maybe having a podcast where I talk about ideas exaggerates that part of my brain. That's something I've talked about in another episode that I can link down below called Why Doesn't My Myers-Briggs Type Fit Me? And what job or life situation you're in can change the way you display your personality. Or even the culture that you live in might value one way of processing, and then that might make you sort of express things differently, even if it's not your natural tendency. Now, it's important to note that this is not measuring a spectrum. I thought when I first encountered this that when you took the test, if you got 60% sensing, that meant that you were 40% intuiting. But it turns out that what the test is really saying is that they're 60% sure that you are a sensor. Or to use the left hand, right hand analogy, they're 60% sure that you prefer to use your right hand. That doesn't mean you can't ever use your other hand, of course, because this is about a preference or a way you naturally process without trying. So this brings up the idea of being put in a box. It's attributed to Carl Jung that he famously said, every person is the exception, meaning while we are categorizing people, we don't want to completely put them into a box and pretend that they don't have capacity to behave differently or that there's not a ton of nuance there. I think this also brings up something that we could do a whole separate episode on the idea of labels having importance to give us vocabulary to talk about ideas. But if we get too fixated on the label, then we miss what that person uniquely is. For instance, I actually think in another 20, 30 years, the idea of borderline personality disorder will be sort of outdated because I think more and more it's coming up that this is a response to trauma relating to also a certain person's genetics, and a lot of people behave this way. However, having that term, at least at this point in society, gives people a useful framework to potentially work towards healing, such as doing DBT or certain styles of therapy. So this is a convoluted way of saying that it is important to know which side of the spectrum you're on. Oh, wait, it's not even a spectrum. See, I find this very confusing. I'll be honest. I just learned this writing for this for like a decade. I thought of it as a spectrum. And some personality tests work as a spectrum, like Big Five. And some people prefer that for that reason. For instance, openness to new experiences is kind of similar to this, and that is on a spectrum. But anyway, point being, we're categorizing, but we're understanding the limitations of categorization. So let's talk about a way that each type is often underestimated and how we can prevent that. I've alluded to these things earlier, but we're going to go deeper into them. A sensor might find the theories that an intuitive talks about as not practical, but there is an expression that I like that says there's nothing more practical than a good theory, because a theory can apply in many different situations versus only having one way to think about something. I'll give an example. Examples are great for everyone, intuitives and sensors. 2 episodes ago, we talked about reducing unwanted screen time. And I talked about the behavior change principle of adding friction when you don't want to do a behavior and reducing friction when you want to do a behavior more often. The reason why I thought it was important to talk about that theory and not just say, use this app, use this lockbox, is because then people can think about how they can apply that theory in ways that work for them, whether for this idea or others. For instance, the idea of reducing friction with adding exercise or by putting your supplements on the counter so that you see them and take them more easily. There are often dozens or hundreds, depending on how creative you want to get, of ways to apply a good theory. And they are very practical if we go about applying them. So now let's talk about sensors. And I'm going to laundry list some ways that I really respect sensors, because for a long time, I used to get frustrated with my friends that were sensors because I'd be trying to have a conversation about ideas that I found interesting. And I felt like they would sort of change the topic away from them. But I've come to realize that I can have different friends that like to talk about different things, and it just makes life a lot more interesting. For instance, when I'm eating with a sensor, they will teach me how to appreciate good food, how to appreciate good music, how to actually put my window AC in the wall, because somehow every year I forget how to actually line it up and which part's supposed to go on the outside and the inside, even though it's probably not that hard for a lot of people. They'll be the ones to tell me, hey, if you get this credit card, it will actually help you get points and then you can travel for free, something that I often just don't naturally think about on my own. And they aren't only good at these, detail-oriented things or sensory-oriented things. They also have this beautiful, grounded, and present way of being in reality. They're the true masters of presence. In a way, I think a lot of intuitives are envious of that being here and now that often life is so much about. And they're often master craftsmen, like we said. When a basketball player like Steph Curry, I don't watch basketball. Does he still play? I don't know. But when they're shooting a free throw, they're not thinking about the technique of shooting a free throw and the idea of mastery. They are in the moment shooting the ball completely here and now. So much that I admire about sensors, and I've been seeking to grow that aspect of myself lately. It's been on my mind quite a bit, hence partly why I'm shooting this episode. And I'm sure that I'm leaving some things out. I mean, of course, this isn't a comprehensive list about what each type brings to the table. So I would also love to hear from you in the comments or in a voicemail about things you admire about people from the opposite type. So an action step here is to learn to value other ways of thinking. If you're a sensor, do not write off your intuitive friends as being lost in the clouds or abstract thoughts, and realize that whatever they're talking about actually probably is connected to reality and in a way that can possibly expand the way you're thinking. And by expand your thinking, I simply mean asking, instead of what is, asking what can be. And for intuitives, do not underestimate the power, stability, and practicality of what sensors provide. Someone that's doing brain surgery or flying a plane, I very much hope and pray that they know about exactly what needs to happen in each moment and don't just know about it in theory, and that they are very in their body and in that moment. It's all about what do we need right now and how do we need to apply it. And again, we can use either form of processing, which brings me to the next idea of learning to develop your other hand, if we use the left hand, right hand analogy. Because while we can focus on growing our strengths, working on the one we're good at, we will enjoy life and get more richness out of life with using both. I already covered a bit about the sensor helping ground the intuitive, but if you are a sensor, if you start to maybe take in art without the idea of taking something as very literal, instead, what is the symbolism here? Or if you're watching the news, going a little bit deeper of like, what is the meaning here? How does this connect to other events? And you might already naturally do this and use this intuitive part of your brain. But I've noticed a sensor friend of mine, the deeper she gets into art, culture, going to different events around New York City, reading challenging books, she used to pretty exclusively have sensor thoughts. And I've noticed over the last 10 years, she has a lot of intuitive thoughts. So again, that's another example of someone getting closer to the middle on that test the older they get and the more well-rounded we get. I'm going to use an example from a time in my life where I got lost in the forest, because this is often about the forest or the trees and how we can meet in the middle. So one time I was working on a visual project, and the creative director sent an image that had a chair in the middle of a forest. And I was talking with some people on this team, and I said, well, I think the chair is a metaphor for something else. It wouldn't actually be a chair. And so I was at the 3,000-foot view of the forest. And then someone else on the team said, no, I think it's about a chair, and I don't think a chair works there, because aesthetics and visuals are actually about what's happening in reality. They are about the trees, not about the forest, because we literally see the tree. And in this case, we see the chair. And is that what we want to be there? And so what I was able to bring to the table is the idea of what are some other objects we could put here? Is there a metaphor? And the other person was bringing the idea of, do we want a chair here? So I don't know. I find it very funny because there's such different ways of looking at the world. And again, we're all capable of both. But this is an example, and I guess they've all been examples of not only can we appreciate the other side, but when we communicate, we're meeting the other side, ideally and hopefully in the middle. And a better example of that, if we go back to talking about the news, there was a person I was very close with, and often we would talk about current events. They would often talk about practically what was happening in the world. A happened, B happened. I would want to talk about, what does this mean? Does this remind me about some other time in history? What are things we could potentially do about this? And we both would talk about, how is this making us feel? So we both were able to access that. But often we would disconnect if, again, they were having one conversation and I was having another. But if I was able to consistently go back to what's happening in reality versus just the meaning of it, I'd be meeting them where they're at. I'd be consistently coming back and grounding the conversation. And if they would sometimes go with me into different abstract thought about, what does this mean? What else does this make me think of? Then I would have felt met in that conversation. There's an idea called a ladder of abstraction. And at the bottom is very concrete details. And at the top might be something like some sort of systemic theory. And there's different steps along that ladder. I will link something in the description about the idea of the ladder of abstraction, because it is connected to this, because intuitives are higher on that ladder and sensors are lower. And again, higher doesn't mean more valuable. It means more of the 3,000-foot view versus the actual forest and the soil. But we need to understand the forest and the soil if we ever want to understand anything. If I were to boil this down to one main takeaway, it would be that if you're an intuitive, ask yourself, have I moved things in tangible reality lately? Have I been moving matter? Have I been in the tangible world enough? Or am I getting stuck in my head in abstractions, ideas, and possibilities? If you're a sensor, the question you can ask yourself is, why? Continually. Asking why moves you up the ladder of abstraction to meaning and the big picture. And I'd like to finish with the idea of how this sort of can approach a Zen-like mindset. Because these are both about processing reality and our thoughts about it, if you go deep enough along a certain path, I actually think that it can lead to the other. For instance, if you approach the idea of fixing your kitchen sink with a lot of care, the intuitive might have to actually drop into the here and now and tangible reality. And there is a meditative quality of that, again, of being here and now, and almost a bit of transcendence in that. And the sensor might drop into that, getting really practical into the here and now, and also feel some transcendence in that, and then make their way back around to the idea about, well, what does it mean to be doing this myself versus hiring someone else? Which makes me think of what I've heard about Zen and the art of motorcycle maintenance, which is the idea of quality and care and doing things yourself. And they both could get to that idea, but through different ways. Maybe one of them came from the idea into a tangible here and now, and then one could go from the tangible here and now and then arrive at an idea from that, maybe through their body, understanding movement, and then be able to come up with a theory that came from their experiential reality. So again, we're capable of both. I think that there's a beautiful thing that can happen when you go deeply into the processing and feel the connection of intuition and sensing, the synthesis of them coming together. Thank you so much for being here. I would love to hear your thoughts on this topic. Like I said, I will link some assessments, maybe one or two down below with some context there. I will link our SpeakPipe account, and I'll also put up on the screen right now how it works. You just go to that website, you click the button where you can record, you can listen back to it to make sure you feel good with it, and then it sends it right to my email inbox if so. And if I feel like it's a good fit to play on a future episode, I will, so that we can start connecting on these ideas and hearing other people's thoughts, not just my own. And even if I don't play it on a future episode, I would just love to hear from you. And if you found this topic helpful, maybe you can share it with a friend and have a conversation this week. Whether either of you are sensors or intuitives or one of each, this might help you understand each other and others in the world a bit better. Speak with you next time, and I believe it will be on our self-esteem series, although you never quite know what's going to come out. I like these topics to be about whatever I'm passionate about at the time, whatever I'm most curious about, but I believe we'll be starting a series on the relationship you have with yourself. Talk to you then.